Okay, we are here to talk from vision to action, alternative perspectives on meeting climate targets in the energy sector. Very nice title. It's talking about vision, talking about action, and of course, the energy transition, which is more or less the topic of all of our panels. And I would like to stress that we're talking about vision, which is something that it's future-oriented, and action, which is something that is part of the future. We have the governor here. He is about action, and of course, vision is something that is necessary, but action is mandatory, more or less, as we speak. And what is very interesting is that our panel, which have common questions, both of you allow me to do that, and we have the best representative of UK here. Will be talking about the governmental central policy approach, and of course, Ms. Vakla, which is a climate tech company, represents a climate tech company, and more or less we're talking about innovation, which is something very important. You're coming from UK, which is, I think, way ahead, especially from many other countries of Europe, but also of Greece. So, if you want a couple of minutes just for an introduction, then I'll proceed with questions. So, Your Excellency, please. Working? Yeah.
Now, there we go, sorry. Good afternoon, great pleasure to be here and to be back at the conference again. Very briefly, by way of introduction, as my colleague from the Dutch Embassy said, we are, as diplomats, I think, the generalists who try and know a little bit about everything. I'll try not to reinforce the sense of knowing nothing in detail about anything. But unapologetically, my perspective will be from the point of view, as Governor Chardalias, I think, has illustrated at a regional level very powerfully about how our actions, including the political direction, including the analysis and study, the policy formulation, the delivery of those policies, and the technical and private sector provision of the results to enable us to change these things, all have to come together, and they have to come together with the populations that these changes impact and who we need to bring with us if we're going to affect the change at the pace that we do. So that's my perspective as a generalist looking across the piece, and I look forward to the discussion, but just to set out that opening remark. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Vakla. Press the button.
Okay. Yeah, there is a lot of energy in the room, and that's pun intended. I've spent half of my life in the United Kingdom. There is a virtuous circle between policy, funding, technology, innovation, consumer behavior, and we're passionate about how this will all evolve. We focus on venture capital investments in technology, in climate tech specifically, and this is a very exciting period for that. I see a lot of collaboration that could potentially take place between the UK and Greece for many reasons, which I believe we'll explore some of that today. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you both. Okay, Your Excellency, what are the opportunities and challenges that UK faces during the energy transition? It's a general question, but we'd like to focus on these two aspects which are very important, and maybe you can be a lighthouse for the rest of Europe, because as also the Chinese ambassador mentioned before, UK is one of the 4 countries globally that have already fulfilled the targets for the climate, neutralization.
Well, yes, we're certainly on track. And I think just to remind ourselves, if everybody needs reminding, that whatever our geographical position in the world, whether a North European country like the United Kingdom or a Mediterranean country like Greece, we are, I think, now in a position where the impact of the climate emergency and climate change is alarmingly and regularly visible for us all. And there is, broadly speaking, a social recognition, a political recognition of the need to change. But of course, it's not just the environmental impacts of the industrialized economy and the impact that's having on our weather systems and the climate. There are also geopolitical drivers that have accelerated the need and the urgency here, and that's why for us, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine back in February 22, the focus on improving our energy security and our resilience at a national, at a European level has gone up dramatically. And as I said in my brief words of introduction, the challenges and opportunities also come in the fact that we can't deliver the changes that we need overnight, and they are not cost-free. So there is a social and economic impact as well. So just as Greek citizens and British citizens and others saw dramatic increases in energy prices following the invasion of Ukraine, and that combines with other disruption of the global economy that affects the cost of living still today for our citizens, we need at the same time not to lose sight of the urgency of action required to tackle the climate crisis, and to be flexible about how we do it so that we can bring people with us. And if those challenges were not enough, then of course, despite the rapid pace of technological development and innovation, we still have a number of technical challenges that present themselves for how we can do this in an effective, affordable and sustainable fashion. Whether that is, and we've heard a lot about offshore wind just now, the production of renewable energy is, I think, something where we've seen remarkable transformation over recent decades. But we're still struggling to work out how to capture and store that. We've still got more to do on carbon capture and storage, and there are urgent needs in the technical space. For example, the shipping community is, I think, increasingly recognizing it needs to address decarbonisation. But I hear from ship owners and charterers regularly, well, you tell us what the answer is, and we'll start to implement it. So there are big challenges, I think, on the scale of the threat, the urgency required, and the impacts that it has right down to individual levels for citizens across our democratic societies. But to finish on a more positive note, there are also enormous opportunities. The energy industry is a massive employer in any case, and globally, I think by 2022 it was employing some 67 million people, which had increased from pre-pandemic levels by some 3.5 million. Now, over a similar period, some nearly 5 million jobs were added globally in the clean energy space. Now, what does that tell us, even from a crude analysis of the figures? Well, yes, we're seeing fewer opportunities in the old traditional fossil fuel industries, and jobs are therefore decreasing there. But for the time being, the new opportunities in new tech, in renewables, and these other areas, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's electric vehicles and batteries, or indeed heat pumps and critical minerals mining, are all areas where there is a growth. So that for our societies where, as I said at the beginning, we depend on being able, and our ministers and politicians depend on being able to bring our populations with us, those are the opportunities that we need to be seizing, so that we can demonstrate that sustainable economic growth and tackling the climate crisis is not a zero-sum game. That actually you can tackle the climate crisis, you can manage the energy transition, and you can do it in a way that our market-driven economies and societies require if we're going to maintain that popular support.
Thank you. Risa, what is your view on that? And maybe mainly focusing on the opportunities that you have seen all these years that you are more or less in this field.
So, from a political standpoint, this is an opportunity for energy leadership. And the UK has demonstrated that better than most in Europe. Coal effectively closed within just 15 years, and our renewables are close to 50% from a point close to zero. This is really impressive. And the UK demonstrated that you can boost adoption when you appropriately combine policy with financial incentives and support of the technological sector. So in terms of opportunities, especially from an investor point of view, there is a huge investment opportunity in tech. You mentioned, Your Excellency mentioned about storage, about a lot of other technologies that are well needed. There is a plethora of cutting-edge technologies that come to solve practical problems, like the shipping industry, for instance, from large corporates that can afford to adopt these technologies and have a need to do so to meet their own clean targets. So they're very receptive, they can finance, support, and adopt this tech now more than ever before. And that creates investment opportunities, and that goes back to the virtuous cycle that we mentioned. But there are challenges. British people say mind the gap. There are a lot of gaps. There's an infrastructure gap that many other speakers have mentioned in terms of the grid. Both the UK and Greece needs to upgrade the grid so it can we can avoid bottlenecks of the supply. And there is also the policy gap. Lack of framework, unstable policies can disrupt investments into a sector which is very hard to navigate anyway. So it adds another investor risk, which we find could be quite disruptive.
I like the mind the gap approach, but you know this gap can easily be filled if you have the necessary funds, which is, I think, it's mandatory, and it's something that your role is to find and of course invest in the right opportunities, in many ways. I really like, Ambassador, that you mentioned a couple of times the society and the social aspect, which is crucial. And you know, one thing is that the energy transition practically involves technical and structural reforms necessary. And how do you empower local communities in UK and raise awareness to avoid any societal backlash, which in Greece is very important?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And I mean, it's interesting. It's not normal an ambassador will highlight something where the Prime Minister ended up getting a lot of criticism. But Prime Minister Sunak a couple of months ago announced some adjustments to our domestic targets and was seized upon, leapt upon by the opposition, criticising him and his government for somehow going soft and backtracking. And there is a big picture strategic messaging argument that I think we've heard about in terms of certainty. But I also think that the strategic approach, the comprehensive vision that the governor, set out just before we sat down this afternoon, is the right one. We've got to have a vision that works internationally, that's why we chaired COP26, works nationally, works regionally, and works right down at the local level. Because the urgency of the task and the complexity of it means that, frankly, we can't afford to do otherwise. But it is also important, without trying to cheat or hoodwink people or deceive them, it's important, I think, that whilst we are working to address what is a major readjustment in the way our economies work and how energy is provided, that people are able to get the early concrete wins. And often that will be down at a local level. So if we are constructing, as we've tried to do in the United Kingdom, by setting out, being the first sort of G20 nation to set out our ambition to reach net zero by 2050, but going one step further by having legally binding targets to require us to do so, and using the tools at the government's disposal to try and incentivize the private sector, because again, it can't be done through a sort of state-driven, publicly funded. It has to engage the full weight of private industry, technology, private funding, research, etc. Using the tools at disposal to get them on board and to incentivize them, which is why we have the carbon budgets program that we have in the UK for setting a cap on emissions. And there's an announcement just today about how we have met the carbon budget emissions reductions targets. So the government is not simply going to roll over the requirement to make it easier for the next period. It's saying, no, we're doing that, but we've got to maintain the pressure and keep on track. And that's why we've already managed between 1990 and 2021 to decarbonise by 48%, and we're aiming by 2035 to do that by 78%. So the targets are there, but the national, if you like, political strategic bit has to be supported at a regional and local level. And that's why way back in 2014, so a full decade ago, the government announced its first community energy strategy. And within that, relevant for governors, relevant for mayors of municipalities, and maybe there's some examples that could be used in Greece here, that is using government legislation and funding to incentivize through different schemes. There's a community energy fund, which was just announced last year, £10 million to support community energy growth in England over the next 2 years. There's a much bigger national level UK Shared Prosperity Fund, some £2.6 billion sterling, which is aimed at local authorities, so not the individual or the community level, but local authorities. And we've got others, what we call the Community Energy Pathways Programme, which is designed to establish community groups to harness that local engagement, set up community solar initiatives, offer innovative heat projects and electric vehicle charge. It makes me think of Astipalia, for example, and the government's initials. So those are really important, but we've got to scale them up, not in skies, but in breadth, so that that's happening across all of our societies. People feel that they're being heard by their governments, they understand what the strategic goal is, and they're able to see early identifiable benefits from their own engagement.
I think it's very important. It's, making people understand that they are part of such a, the energy transition concept is very important. How do you see that in terms of funding or finding companies that should be funded by whatever, venture capitals or whatever?
I think funding is not difficult to find these days. Despite the difficult economic environment last year, there is a lot of funds right now, including private investors that goes into that sector. What we need to do, however, is to avoid greenwashing. You spoke about societal backlash, and I'm quite conscious from where I sit that the corporate world and the investment management world has been guilty for ESG labeling products to market them without being able to substantiate that. And I don't believe that regulation only could magically eradicate that. I might be idealistic, but I feel that by educating your people, educating the public, you're also educating consumers, investors, to a point that we will be able to read between these green lines and eventually eliminate them. And education is key. And Your Excellency, you spoke about educating and bringing people on board. I think it's important to be transparent. We're going through one of the most major revolutions in energy that affects everyday life, the way we commute, live, communicate. We can't just tell people that clean energy is good for them, show them scary statistics about the environment and expect them to be on board. We need to clearly articulate what this means, not just for the environment, but each one of us personally. Be transparent, talk about not just the long-term benefits, but also how, the convenience that it will bring, short-term price increases, for instance. So be very clear about all the components involved, good or bad, to be able to bring people on board. And then avoid situations of misinformation, for instance, or mistrust.
I'm taking this, it was heard in a previous panel that the price of energy, it's something that people really understand easily, but something that is quite hidden is that when you're talking about the price of energy, you should include externalities. And when it comes to climate change, externalities could be huge, and it's paid by everyone. So when you talk about green energy, and we talk about whatever black energy, name it, whatever, we should always consider that now energy is not only that's the power, the price per kilowatt hour that we are paying, it's also what we have to pay. For example, in Greece we had Daniel, we paid billions, and it was paid by everybody. So we should include that. It's very important. It's something that people don't understand. It's something education needs to be clear on that, and it's not done. Coming to you, I know. Yeah.
Just a very quick point. I mean, I always hesitate to talk about a national example which may or may not be applicable in a different context. But I think there's a very interesting scheme that the government has introduced in the UK in recent years. And we have the independent regulator, the Office for Gas and Electricity Markets, Ofgem. And they have what's called an energy redress scheme, which the government supports to the tune of some £20 million, but is essentially a partnership between the regulator and industry, whereby if industry is failing to meet the targets or to meet the rules that are in place, the environmental, the energy transition rules, they make a payment to Ofgem, which is then targeted at the most vulnerable groups in society, energy communities, households most at risk of cold homes and high energy bills, and helping them develop products and services for that domestic use. So, you know, it's not going to solve the problem, but it is, I think, a fascinating example. There have been some 500 plus projects dispersing £100 million over recent years, since 2018, as part of this scheme. So again, it comes back to the point, it addresses the challenge of externalities, and you know, ultimately this all comes back to everybody. But it comes back to the point about how, rather than imposing something, you can work as an interested community, society, to try and bring people with you.
That's interesting. Okay, how does the UK finance sustainable energy investments? What's the recipe, and what have you been doing up to now in order to accelerate the energy transition?
I don't want to dazzle you all with figures and plans. We've got our 10-point plan for the green industrial revolution. We've got the energy security strategy, and we've got other programs that I've talked about already. I think the key point from us is that, as I said earlier on, there is a recognition, and has been from the outset, that we must engage private sector funding. You cannot just do this through the state. But that the government has an essential role to play in creating the stability to encourage investors, I hear your point, but in also incentivizing that investment and providing some structure and framework with it. So with our net zero strategy setting out the ambition, with the 10-point plan and with the energy strategy, we are aiming, okay, this is a bigger economy than Greece, but we're aiming to try and drive some £100 billion of private investment by 2030. A couple of examples. We're aiming to produce 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which would be more than enough to power every home in the United Kingdom. And 5 gigawatts of that will come from floating offshore wind in deeper seas. And where does the government play its part in this? It's about providing that vision, that certainty, but also supporting planning reforms, which will reduce the time it takes for new projects to reach the construction stage, whilst protecting the environment, and crucially then making sure the grid is able to take that capacity. Oil and gas, controversial perhaps if we're talking about the energy transition, but there is a recognition, I think, in the UK public debate now, that for the foreseeable future, we have to be running both old fossil fuel production sources as clean as we can, so on, in parallel with renewables and low carbon. And therefore, it's self-evident, I think, as seen from us, that new North Sea oil and gas projects are a better way of going than importing, with a bigger carbon footprint, our gas and energy from abroad, and it also serves the domestic political priorities of energy security and giving back to the domestic economy. And another example, I won't go through them all, on solar capacity, not one we always think about in the United Kingdom, but it's there. We've currently got some 14 gigawatts, and we're aiming to grow this quite significantly, maybe by as much as 5 times by 2035, but doing so in a way where we can perhaps learn from the Greek example or from the Mediterranean example about panels on rooftops and water heaters and so on. So those are just a few snapshots, but essentially the single sentence answer to your question, Spiro, is we have to do this by creating a regulatory framework which offers the predictability and stability to attract private sector investment at the scale that we need. And that's very easily said, it's much harder done.
Thank you. Chrisa, I'd like to merge the previous question with the next one, which comes more or less, the final question comes to Greece. And please, let me have your idea about financing projects in UK and with definite advantages, and how this regime can come also to Greece. What are the potential positive things that you could find in Greece, advantages, and what we could really deploy from the UK's experience, and what they are very strong, let's say, and we could take in Greece, maybe if we could, wish to take.
Yes, so the UK has one of the most impressive venture capital scenes in Europe by far. There are 20 innovation hubs and research centers dedicated to climate tech and sustainability. There are 600 venture capital and private equity funds. A third of them are dedicated in climate tech and energy tech. And despite the challenging environment last year, London-based startups only in energy managed to raise 3.5 billion in funding rounds, which is, in comparison, more than the whole Europe together has done in that sector. So we're talking about a mature place for startups with innovative technologies in climate to flourish. So definitely we have lots to learn and combine. When we look at Greece, I think more or less we spoke about the opportunities here of the environment, the geographic position, the renewable resources that are abundant. So for large corporate firms in the UK and Northern Europe, of course, Greece has tremendous opportunity for collaborations. Now, for smaller companies, let's take innovative solutions in the UK or the startups that I mentioned. Demand for innovative technologies from local energy players over here is going to grow. It's going to grow rapidly. And at the moment, we still have projects on feasibility study and desk level in terms of preparation. So once these projects become more mature and go into development and implementation, you now have a receptive market that will require these technologies and these collaborations to happen. And I mean, there are areas that we are lacking experience over here. We spoke about offshore wind. There are 15 gigawatt of offshore wind already being in capacity and the operation in the UK. We're still a few years ahead before we start developing these projects here. We will need these companies to collaborate with us. And this is an untapped territory. I think this is something that UK early stage companies might not have realized yet. And with the investment community and all of us together could make this bridge.
Ambassador, I know that you have a very special relationship with our country. You really love it. You have personal relationship with Greece. So what would be your proposal for us in order to, and I don't know if we could reach UK, but anyway, the pathway is there. More or less you're following the same pathway. So what would you say, if you could say some bullet points that the Greek government or the Greek entities should follow the next 5 years in order to speed up the energy transition in any way?
Thank you. I'll try and give you 3 or 4 points. I think the first one, and I'm not here to advocate for the current government or get into domestic politics, but is to continue what it is doing now after the financial crisis in rebuilding very effectively and very impressively domestic and international confidence in the direction of the Greek economy, attracting inward investment and creating locally here in Greece, just what we were talking about a moment ago, a stable and predictable regulatory environment so that investors are attracted. So there's work to be done, as there is for all of us, but that is the right direction to be moving. From an unapologetically UK-Greek perspective, I think I would say we need, this is my job in many ways, but we need to be harnessing the connections that go back over decades between Greece and the United Kingdom, which sees very real expertise across British society, in business, in academia, the university sector, and elsewhere in other sectors, where that gives us the opportunity for connections and understandings. I think there is, again, a job to be done. The UK's in a particular domestic political place at the moment as we work out our post-EU exit direction of travel. But I think there are, and thirdly, making sure, picking up on the point we just heard, that I think locally the vision is not limited to Europe and the near abroad, but that actually through London, harnessing international expertise and know-how and finance is really important. And from the UK point of view, putting aside European politics or our own decision to leave the European Union, we're very anxious to make sure, back through the Horizon programme, through our interests and relationships in this part of Europe, that we are fully engaged and that our businesses are reflecting the strength of our historic relationship and partnership. So the third bit there would be to have the vision. And then the fourth one would, I think, be to make sure we are asking ourselves as friends and allies whether we're learning the lessons from one another that we can, whether that's about bringing UK proven offshore wind technology here to help development in the Greek market, or whether we can learn from how Greece has been and is developing itself as a regional energy hub.
Thank you both. I know we are way out of time, and thank you both that we try to bridge vision with action, hopefully, for our audience. It was quite educational, what both of you tried to present. Thank you both for being here. Thank you both for being with our conference and for your support.